The bank manager didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His face went pale, the kind of pale that drains all the color out of a man at once, like his body already knew what his mouth was about to say. He stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. Lock the front doors, he told the teller, his eyes never leaving me. Then he turned and picked up the phone with shaking fingers. And call the police. Now. He looked at the old savings passbook in my hands like it was a loaded weapon. The same passbook my father had thrown into a trash can 2 days earlier at my grandfather's funeral, saying, "It's old. Whatever this is, it should have stayed buried." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 32 years old. I'm an active-duty service member in the United States Air Force, currently stationed at a base 3 states away from the town where I grew up. I wear my hair tight, my boots polished, and my emotions controlled. The military teaches you how to compartmentalize, how to put grief in one box, anger in another, and keep moving forward because someone is always counting on you to do your job. When my grandfather died, I was granted 3 days of emergency leave. 3 days to come home, bury a man who had quietly been the most stable presence in my life, and then return to base like nothing had changed. I told myself I could do that. I've handled worse under pressure, but families have a way of finding the cracks you didn't know were there. The funeral was held in a small chapel outside of town, the kind with beige walls, folding chairs, and a cross that looked like it had been hanging there since the 70s. The air smelled faintly of lilies and burnt coffee. People shook my hand and thanked me for my service. Their voices hushed, respectful, like my uniform gave me some kind of moral authority in the room. I wished it did. My father, Richard Donovan, stood near the front, receiving condolences, like a man accepting congratulations after a long meeting. He looked composed. Too composed. Black suit, crisp tie, posture straight. If you didn't know him, you'd think he was grieving with quiet dignity. If you did know him, you'd recognize the tension in his jaw, the look he got when things weren't fully under his control. My grandfather, Thomas Donovan, had been 88 years old. He worked as a municipal accountant for most of his life. Numbers were his language. He trusted systems records and things that could be verified twice. He lived in the same modest house for 40 years, drove the same truck until it physically could not move anymore, and wore the same jacket every winter, even after the lining tore. Everyone assumed he didn't have much. My father encouraged that assumption. After the service, we gathered at my grandfather's house. People drifted from room to room, making small talk, drinking soda from paper cups. My father was already talking about logistics, what would need to be sold, what repairs were unnecessary, how quickly the property could be cleared. He spoke with authority, like the decisions had already been made. I slipped away to my grandfather's study. It was the smallest room in the house, but it had always been my favorite. The shelves were lined with old binders and accounting manuals. The desk still smelled faintly of pencil shavings and lemon oil. I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said to him while I still could. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was tucked into the bottom drawer of his desk, plain white, my name written on the front in his careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside was an old savings passbook. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like something you'd find forgotten in the back of a drawer, not something that mattered anymore. There was also a small note folded once. "Before you go back to base, take this to the bank. Ask for the full history. And Claire, don't trust your father." My chest tightened. I didn't have time to process it before footsteps sounded behind me. My father filled the doorway, his eyes immediately locking onto what I was holding. The change in his expression was instant, sharp, too sharp. "What's that?" he asked. "Something Grandpa left for me," I said carefully. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed the passbook from my hands, barely glanced at it, and then, without hesitation, threw it straight into the kitchen trash can. "It's old," he said flatly. "Whatever this is, it doesn't matter anymore. Some things should stay buried." The room went quiet. A few relatives glanced over, then quickly looked away. No one said a word. I stood there in my dress blues, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart pounding. In the military, you learn to read reactions. Overreaction is the clearest tell there is. If the passbook meant nothing, my father would have laughed it off. He would have dismissed it. He wouldn't have needed to destroy it. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the moment, his speed, his anger, the exact words he used. Stay buried. People don't use language like that unless there's something they're afraid will be uncovered. At 5 the next morning, before anyone else was awake, I went back to my grandfather's house. I pulled the trash bag from the can and tied it off my hands steady despite everything racing through my head. I found the passbook near the bottom, wrapped in paper towels and coffee grounds. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and took photos of every page, every mark, every number. Old habits die hard. In my line of work, you document first and ask questions later. Before I left town, before I returned to base, I made one last stop. The bank. I didn't expect much, maybe a few $100s, maybe nothing. Mostly I wanted answers. I walked into the small regional branch with the passbook, my ID, and my grandfather's death certificate. The teller smiled politely as she took the book from my hands and typed the account number into her computer. Her smile faded. She excused herself and disappeared into the back. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, a man in a dark suit approached and asked me to follow him to a private office. That was when the color drained from his face. That was when he told them to lock the doors. And that was when I realized my grandfather hadn't asked me to go to the bank for closure. He'd asked me to go for justice. I sat alone in that small office while the bank manager made his phone calls, the old passbook resting on the polished desk between us, like it could hear everything being said about it. The walls were decorated with framed certificates and a faded photo of the town's first bank building from decades ago. The air smelled faintly of dust and copier toner. Somewhere beyond the closed door, I could hear muffled voices and the low hum of printers. But before any of that, before the pale face, the locked doors, the police, I need to take you back again. Because what happened at the bank only made sense once I fully understood what had been happening inside my own family for years. Growing up, my father was the unquestioned authority in our house. His word wasn't just final, it was law. He believed respect flowed in one direction only, and disagreement was the same as disobedience. When I enlisted at 19, it felt less like a career choice and more like an escape. The military gave me structure, clarity, and rules that were applied evenly. My father never forgave me for choosing that over staying home and doing things his way. My grandfather was different. He listened. He asked questions. He never talked down to me even when I was a kid who didn't know much about the world. When I visited him during leave, we'd sit at his kitchen table with mugs of weak coffee, and he'd tell me stories about balancing city budgets, about mistakes people made when they assumed no one was paying attention. Most fraud isn't clever, he used to say. It's just patient. After my grandmother died, my father stepped in to help. That was the word he used. He handled bills, managed appointments, organized paperwork. On the surface, it looked responsible, noble even. But over time, I noticed how my grandfather's world began to shrink. Fewer visitors, fewer phone calls. My father always had an explanation. Grandpa was tired. Grandpa was confused. Grandpa didn't feel up to company. The last time I saw my grandfather alive 2 weeks before he passed, he seemed thinner but sharper than ever. He pulled me aside after dinner, his hand surprisingly strong around my wrist. "Your father thinks I don't notice things anymore," he said quietly. "But I notice plenty." Then he told me he'd left something for me. "You're the only one who'll look all the way through it." At the time, I thought he meant a letter, maybe advice. I didn't imagine it would be a passbook my father would try to erase from existence. After retrieving the passbook from the trash, I drove back to my childhood home to pack. My father was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes flicking briefly to my bag. "You heading back to base?" he asked. "Soon," I said. He nodded. "Good. Best not to linger. Too many emotions clouding people's judgment." There it was again, that careful framing. Emotions were always the problem, never actions, never evidence. My phone buzzed as I was loading my car. A text from my father. "You didn't take anything else from the house, did you?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "Just some old photos." The response came almost immediately. "Fine. Don't dig through things that aren't yours." That sealed it. People who aren't hiding anything don't monitor what you might have taken. On the drive to the bank, I kept the radio off. I needed to think. The passbook sat on the passenger seat, buckled in like a fragile witness. I flipped through it at a stoplight. The account entries were sparse, but the numbering felt wrong. Too modern for something supposedly opened decades ago. It didn't match the story my father wanted everyone to believe, that my grandfather had been a confused old man clinging to relics. When I walked into the bank, I was prepared to be disappointed. I wasn't prepared for fear. The teller's hands shook as she typed. She kept glancing at the screen, then at the passbook, then back at me. When she excused herself, I noticed the security guard watching me more closely now. Not suspicious, curious, like something unusual had just happened. The manager introduced himself as Mark Hensley. Late 50s, thinning gray hair, voice carefully neutral. He asked for my ID, my grandfather's death certificate, and proof of relationship. I handed everything over without a word. He nodded, then closed the office door behind us. This account, he said, slowly wasn't opened when the passbook cover suggests. My stomach tightened. When was it opened? About 12 years ago, he said, and it was deliberately disguised. He explained that my grandfather had used an old passbook cover to hide a modern savings instrument, one with compound interest untouched for years. The balance had grown quietly, steadily. When he slid the printed statement across the desk, my breath caught. The number was just over $2 million. I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. My grandfather, who wore shoes until the soles peeled, had been sitting on a fortune no one knew about. But Hensley wasn't smiling. "There's more," he said. In 2017, someone attempted to access this account using power of attorney documents. The request was denied due to signature inconsistencies. Who, I asked, already knowing the answer. He looked me in the eye. "Your father." The room seemed to tilt. Every memory snapped into place, the isolation, the control, the insistence that Grandpa was losing his mind. My father hadn't been helping. He'd been testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Hensley cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances, this account is now considered evidence. I've contacted our security division. We're required to notify law enforcement." I nodded slowly. In uniform, I'd stood in situations where panic would have been understandable, but discipline kept me steady. This felt the same. Controlled, focused. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth, documented. As Hensley picked up the phone again, I thought about my grandfather's note. Don't trust your father. He hadn't asked me to confront anyone. He hadn't asked me to accuse. He'd asked me to verify. And that was something I knew how to do. The police arrived quietly without sirens. 2 officers from the County Financial Crimes Unit. They spoke in low voices with the bank manager, then asked me to recount everything from the moment I found the passbook. I did carefully, chronologically, the way I'd been trained to brief a superior officer. Facts first, times, words used, actions taken. I showed them the photos I'd uploaded to cloud storage before ever walking into the bank. One of the officers nodded, impressed. "Most people don't think to do that," she said. I told her the military has a way of teaching you what matters when stories start to change. They thanked me, took copies of my documents, and told me they'd be in touch. As I walked back to my car, the weight of it all finally settled in. My grandfather hadn't just been cautious. He'd been preparing, and he'd trusted me, specifically me, to finish what he couldn't. The first call came before I even left the parking lot. It was my father. His name lit up my screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But avoiding him would raise suspicion, and by then I understood something important. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting the truth surface on its own. "Claire," he said, his voice measured. "Just wanted to check in. Make sure you got back safely." "I'm still in town," I replied. A pause. "Oh, I thought you'd be heading out already." "Had an errand," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "You didn't take that old book with you, did you?" There it was. The fishing line cast again, just to see what I'd bite. "I took photos," I said. "Thought Grandpa might have wanted me to keep a record." His breath hitched, just barely audible. "You're overthinking this," he said quickly. "Your grandfather wasn't himself toward the end. He got confused. He held on to things that didn't mean anything anymore." "I didn't think confusion looked like planning," I said calmly. His voice hardened. "You're not a lawyer. You're not an accountant. You're a soldier. Stay in your lane." I almost laughed. He'd spent my entire childhood telling me I was too curious, too observant, too unwilling to accept easy answers. Now suddenly curiosity was a liability. "I have to go," I said. "I'll call you later." I didn't. That night I stayed at a motel just off the highway, the kind with thin walls and humming ice machines. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's hand dropping the passbook into the trash, heard the finality in his voice when he said it should have stayed buried. The next morning my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was Detective Laura Mills, the officer from the bank. "We've started pulling records," she said. "Your grandfather wasn't wrong to be careful." She explained that over the last decade, there had been several complaints filed in similar cases, elder financial abuse masked as caregiving. In most of them, the paper trail had been erased before anyone took the victim seriously. "Your grandfather documented everything," she said. "That's rare." Later that afternoon, I received another call, this one from an attorney named Samuel Whitaker. He was 76 years old and had been my grandfather's friend for more than 30 years. "Tom told me to call you if anything happened," he said. "Only you." His office was in a quiet part of town, the kind of place that still had law books lining the walls and a brass nameplate on the door. He shook my hand firmly and offered me tea before sitting down across from me with a thick folder. "Your grandfather came to me 3 years ago," he said. "He believed your father was trying to take control of his finances." I swallowed hard. Hearing it out loud made it real in a way the numbers hadn't yet. "He knew no one would believe him," Whitaker continued. "Your father had convinced doctors and the rest of the family that Tom was declining mentally. But Tom was meticulous. He brought me records, notes, copies of forged documents. He asked me to hold them until someone he trusted could act." He slid the folder toward me. Inside were bank statements, handwriting comparisons, and a notarized declaration written in my grandfather's steady hand. "I am of sound mind," it began. "I am being isolated. I am being misrepresented. And I am leaving this record for my granddaughter Claire because she will ask the questions others avoid." I felt something crack open in my chest. In a family where I'd always been told I was difficult, my grandfather had seen strength. Whitaker looked at me gently. He didn't want a fight, he said. He wanted accountability. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. My father, my aunt, my younger brother, all variations of the same message, "Let it go." "You're misinterpreting things. You're tearing the family apart." I documented everything. Dates, times, exact phrases. I forwarded it all to Detective Mills. The warrants were issued a week later. I wasn't present when my father was arrested. I was already back on base, back in uniform, standing in formation like nothing had changed. But something had. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. The system my grandfather had trusted was finally moving. When Detective Mills called to tell me my father had been taken into custody on charges of fraud and elder abuse, I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. My grandfather had spent years building a case not out of bitterness, but out of patience. He hadn't been waiting for someone to save him. He'd been waiting for someone to finish the work. And now, whether my family liked it or not, that work was going to be seen through. The investigation moved faster than I expected, but not faster than my grandfather had planned for. That became clear as Detective Mills began connecting dots that stretched back more than a decade. Each call from her added another piece to a picture I hadn't wanted to see but could no longer deny. My father hadn't just tried once. He'd tried repeatedly, quietly, methodically testing systems the way a burglar tests doors. He applied for power of attorney under the guise of managing medical decisions. He rerouted mail. He convinced a family doctor that my grandfather was confused, forgetful, a risk to himself. Once that label stuck, it did the rest of the work for him. People stop listening when they think you're losing your mind. When I asked Detective Mills how common that was, she didn't hesitate. It's one of the oldest tricks, she said. Undermine credibility, then drain assets. Back at the bank, the account that triggered everything had been flagged, not just for its balance, but for its structure. My grandfather had opened it under a specific savings instrument that required in-person verification for withdrawals. He'd used an old Passbook cover as camouflage, knowing my father would dismiss it as outdated. That small detail, the junk my father was so quick to throw away, had saved more than $2 million. The bank's internal audit uncovered something else: transfers from other accounts that should have been part of my grandfather's estate, but were quietly emptied years earlier. Those funds had gone through a series of shell accounts before landing in places my father controlled. A remodeled kitchen, a boat he claimed was paid off, an investment account he'd bragged about at family dinners. Every lie suddenly had a receipt. I was called back to town to give a formal statement. Sitting in the interview room, I spoke calmly, answering questions I'd rehearsed in my head during long night shifts on base. I explained my relationship with my grandfather, my father's behavior, the moment the passbook was destroyed, the note, the bank visit, the calls afterward. "Did your father ever threaten you?" the assistant district attorney asked. "No," I said. "He didn't have to. Control doesn't always sound like shouting." They nodded. They'd heard that before. My father's lawyer tried a different strategy. He requested a meeting framed as an attempt to clear misunderstandings. I declined. The prosecution advised against it, and for once my instincts aligned perfectly with protocol. There was nothing to discuss. Conversations were where my father thrived, where he twisted language until facts felt optional. When the case reached the preliminary hearing, I attended in uniform, not as a statement, not as a challenge, just as myself. I sat in the back, hands folded, watching my father avoid my eyes. He looked smaller there, not powerless, just exposed. The defense argued that my grandfather had been confused, that my father had acted in good faith, that family disagreements had been misinterpreted as criminal behavior. The judge listened patiently, then asked for documentation. That's when the prosecution presented my grandfather's notarized statement. The courtroom went quiet as it was read aloud. His words were clear, precise, unmistakably his. He described the isolation, the missing funds, the false narratives about his mental state. He named my father directly. He stated his intent to preserve evidence and protect what remained of his estate. When the judge looked up, his expression had changed. If your client believed Mr. Donovan was incompetent, he asked the defense attorney why did he need to forge signatures. There it was, the question my father had no answer for. The trial itself took months. I returned to base deployed for training, lived 2 lives at once. Soldier by day, witness by night. Updates came through emails and scheduled calls. Each one confirmed what we already knew. My father was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, elder financial abuse, and forgery. He received a sentence that reflected both the amount stolen and the length of time he'd spent committing the crimes. Restitution was ordered. Assets were seized. I didn't attend sentencing. I didn't need to. Closure doesn't always require presence. A week later, I met with Samuel Whitaker again. He looked tired but satisfied. "Your grandfather's will was very clear," he said, sliding a single envelope across the desk. He anticipated this outcome. Inside was a letter addressed to me. "Claire," it began. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally been acknowledged. I'm sorry I had to put this burden on you, but I knew you would carry it with integrity." He wrote about patience, about systems, about how doing the right thing often meant waiting longer than was comfortable. He thanked me for asking questions, for not being afraid of conflict when evidence demanded it. At the bottom, he'd written one final line: "You didn't betray anyone. You honored me." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The money, what remained and what would be recovered, felt secondary. Important, yes, but not the point. The point was that my grandfather had been heard, that his voice hadn't been erased by convenience or control. As I drove back to base that night, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Peace. Not the absence of pain, not forgiveness, just the quiet certainty that I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No dramatic confrontations, no tearful apologies, just paperwork, court dates I didn't attend, and a slow unwinding of a life my father had built on other people's money and silence. In the military, we call that the long tail, everything that follows the impact. Samuel Whitaker kept me informed. He was methodical the way my grandfather had been. Each call came with updates, assets, frozen accounts, traced properties evaluated. My father's lawyer made one final attempt to reach me, suggesting a meeting for closure. I declined again. Closure isn't something you negotiate. It's something you arrive at when the truth stops moving. The restitution process took months. Funds were clawed back from accounts my father had shifted through shell entities, the kind designed to look legitimate at a glance and meaningless if you didn't know where to look. He'd been careful, not careful enough. I learned later that my younger brother had known more than he admitted. He wasn't charged, there wasn't enough evidence, but the realization stung anyway. Silence can be a form of participation. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. The distance between us said enough. While the case worked its way through the system, I stayed on base. Training cycles continued. Inspections came and went. My days were predictable again, which was a relief. There's comfort in routines that don't ask you to explain yourself. But grief doesn't follow schedules. It showed up in small moments. The smell of coffee in the mornings reminded me of my grandfather's kitchen. A ledger I saw during a briefing made me think of the careful columns he used to draw by hand. Once during a late shift, I caught myself reaching for my phone to call him just to tell him how it had turned out. That was the hardest part, knowing he'd planned for justice but wouldn't get to see it happen. When the final accounting was complete, Whitaker called me into his office one last time. He looked relieved, like a man who had carried someone else's secret long enough. He explained the numbers calmly without drama. After restitution and the recovery of remaining assets, the total inheritance amounted to just over $2 million. I nodded, absorbing it without excitement. "Your grandfather didn't see this as a reward," Whitaker said gently. "He saw it as a responsibility." I understood that. Money doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rewrite the past. But it does give you choices. I took a week of leave and drove to the coast alone. I needed space to think without the weight of other people's expectations. I walked along the shoreline at dawn, the air sharp with salt waves steady and indifferent. I thought about my grandfather's patience, about how he'd trusted systems, not emotions, about how he'd chosen me not because I was perfect, but because I was persistent. When I returned to base, I made decisions quietly. I paid off my student loans. I set aside funds for retirement. I donated to an organization that supports seniors facing financial exploitation, one my grandfather would have approved of. No plaques, no press, just structure and purpose. I also bought my grandfather's house. The decision surprised some people. They assumed I'd sell it, take the money, move on. But the house wasn't about nostalgia. It was about continuity. I renovated it, carefully preserving the study exactly as it had been. The desk, the shelves, even the faint smell of lemon oil. It became a place I could return to, a reminder of where patience and truth can lead. My father wrote to me once from prison. The letter was long, winding, full of explanations that felt more like rehearsed defenses than remorse. He spoke about family loyalty, about misunderstandings, about how I'd taken things too far. I read it once, then I placed it back in the envelope and filed it away. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Some narratives don't deserve a response. A year after the sentencing, I stood in my grandfather's study, sunlight cutting across the desk where it all began. I opened the drawer where the passbook had been hidden. It was empty now, but the space itself felt meaningful. Proof that small things preserved carefully can outlast attempts to erase them. In uniform, I've been taught that accountability is non-negotiable, that integrity isn't situational. My grandfather understood that long before I did. He lived it quietly, patiently, trusting that if the record was clear enough, the truth would eventually speak for itself. He was right. And in honoring that, I didn't just protect his legacy. I found my own. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold Tuesday morning in early February. I didn't plan to attend, but the night before, something restless kept me awake. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was the sense that this chapter, the one my grandfather had started and I had carried forward, deserved to be witnessed to its end. So I put on my uniform and drove to the courthouse. The building was older than it looked from the outside, all dark wood and high ceilings, the kind of place designed to remind you that consequences outlast excuses. The American flag hung behind the judge's bench perfectly still. I took a seat near the back, far enough away that I didn't feel like a spectacle, close enough that I could hear every word. My father sat at the defense table. His suit hung looser on him now. He looked thinner, older, as if the months of waiting had finally taken their toll. When he glanced around the room, his eyes skipped over me at first. Then they landed. For half a second, something crossed his face, surprise maybe, or calculation. Then his expression hardened into something familiar. Control, or what was left of it. The prosecutor stood and summarized the case. Not emotionally, methodically. Dates, amounts, documents, the slow siphoning of funds, the forged signatures, the deliberate isolation of an elderly man deemed confused by the very person stealing from him. Then she asked to read a statement from the victim. The courtroom quieted. She read my grandfather's words aloud, her voice steady. He described the moment he realized money was missing, the first time he asked my father for clarification and was brushed aside. The way his phone calls stopped being returned. The appointments he didn't remember scheduling. The fear that no one would believe him because the story had already been written for him. I watched my father as those words filled the room. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists on the table, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't object, because this time there was nothing he could reframe. When the prosecutor finished, the judge leaned forward slightly and addressed the defense. Counsel, he said your argument rests heavily on the claim that Mr. Donovan believed his father was mentally incompetent. Is that correct? The defense attorney nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge paused, then asked quietly, "Then why was it necessary to forge his signature?" The silence that followed was complete. The defense attorney opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. There was no good answer, only bad ones. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He simply nodded once, as if a final piece had fallen into place. Sentencing followed shortly after. My father was sentenced to several years in federal prison. Full restitution was ordered. Assets seized. Accounts liquidated. The judge spoke about betrayal of trust, about the particular cruelty of exploiting someone who depends on you. He spoke about deterrence, about accountability. I didn't feel satisfaction as the gavel came down. I felt something quieter. Completion. Outside the courthouse, snow flurries drifted lazily through the air. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing it in, letting the cold sharpen my senses. Detective Mills spotted me and walked over. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said simply. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. A few weeks later, my father's attorney contacted me one last time. He said my father wanted to speak with me, to apologize, to explain, to clear the air. I thought about it longer than I expected. In the end, I declined. Not out of spite, but because explanations offered after consequences aren't always about accountability. Sometimes they're just another attempt to control the narrative. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. I returned fully to my duties. Promotions were considered, new responsibilities added. On the surface, nothing about me had changed. But internally, something had shifted. The weight I'd carried for years, the unspoken tension, the sense of always being on guard around my own family had lifted. Samuel Whitaker mailed me one final package. Inside was the original passbook returned now that the investigation was complete, along with certified copies of all documents. On top was a short note in his neat handwriting. Tom always believed the truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be preserved. I placed the passbook back into my grandfather's desk drawer the next time I visited the house. Not because it was needed anymore, but because it had earned its place. Some people think revenge is about humiliation, about public shame, about watching someone suffer. They're wrong. Sometimes revenge looks like patience, like records kept quietly, like systems doing exactly what they're supposed to do when someone finally refuses to look away. My grandfather understood that. And now so do I. The last letter arrived on a quiet afternoon nearly 6 months after the sentencing. I recognized Samuel Whitaker's handwriting immediately, neat, deliberate, every letter given just enough space to breathe. There was no return address drama, no legal markings on the envelope. Just my name written the way people write when they expect to be taken seriously. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope tucked beneath it. The note was brief. Claire, there is one final item your grandfather instructed me to give you only after everything was resolved. He was very specific about the timing. I believe now is the right moment. Sam. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before opening the smaller envelope. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the blind's dust motes drifting lazily in the air. For the first time in months, there was no investigation pending, no court date looming, no phone call I was bracing myself to receive. Just quiet. The envelope contained a letter in my grandfather's handwriting. Not the formal, careful script he used for records and declarations, but the softer version I remembered from birthday cards and short notes he'd leave on the counter when I visited. The version meant only for family. My dear Claire, if you are reading this, then everything unfolded the way I hoped it would. I'm sorry you had to carry this burden. I know it wasn't fair. But I also know you were the only one who could do it without letting anger ruin the truth. He wrote about watching me grow up, about noticing even when I was a teenager how I paid attention when others didn't, how I asked why even when it made people uncomfortable, how leaving for the military hadn't been running away but choosing a life where integrity mattered more than approval. Your father believes authority means never being questioned, he wrote. I learned long ago that authority without accountability is just control. He explained gently why he hadn't confronted my father directly, why he hadn't tried to expose everything while he was alive. He knew he'd already been labeled unreliable. He knew the system wouldn't listen to him then. So he waited. He documented. He prepared. The truth is patient, he wrote. It can wait longer than any lie. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the page. Not the sharp, painful kind. The kind that comes when something heavy finally settles into place. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I sat there, hands resting on the table, feeling something I hadn't felt since before the funeral. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, peace. In the months that followed, life didn't transform overnight. There was no dramatic reinvention. I didn't quit my job or disappear into some fantasy version of healing. I stayed in the Air Force. I continued my service. Structure still mattered to me. Purpose still mattered. But the way I lived inside that structure changed. I used part of the inheritance to establish a small trust dedicated to helping seniors navigate financial decisions, free consultations, document reviews, education on recognizing manipulation, quiet help, practical help, the kind my grandfather would have appreciated. I restored his house fully, not to modernize it, but to preserve it. The study remained exactly the same. The desk, the shelves, the faint smell of lemon oil and old paper. On the wall above the desk, I framed his favorite sentence, handwritten and simple. The truth is patient. My father wrote again. Then again. His letters followed a pattern. Blame softened into regret. Regret reshaped into requests. He spoke about family, about forgiveness, about how much time he had to think now. I didn't respond. Some people mistake silence for cruelty, but silence can also be a boundary, and boundaries, I've learned, are a form of respect, especially self-respect. My younger brother called once. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for favors. He just said he was sorry. I believed him. We're careful with each other now. Honest. That's enough. Every so often I take the passbook out of the drawer and hold it for a moment. Not because I need it, not because it represents wealth, but because it reminds me of something far more valuable. That one person paying attention can outlast years of manipulation. That systems work when someone insists on using them properly. That doing the right thing doesn't always feel brave in the moment, but it echoes longer than fear ever could. If you're still listening, I want you to know this. If something doesn't add up, you're not wrong for noticing. If someone tells you to stop asking questions, that's usually the moment you should ask more. And if you're carrying a truth that feels heavy, remember you don't have to shout it to make it real. You just have to preserve it. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from or what part stayed with you the most. We share stories like this because they remind us we're not alone, and because sometimes the quiet ones are the ones worth hearing all the way through. There are many more stories waiting for you here. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for listening, truly.